Good morning. Well, this is our last time together. I might be a little too amplified, and how is it in back now? Is it okay? Okay. Well, so far I've had the opportunity to sketch some ideas about perception and cognition and cognitive emotional interactions. So in the final talk today, I'd like to say a little bit about some issues in sensory motor control. In particular, what is a motor program? How do we use symbolic plans to generate continuous movements? How are spatial representations of target positions learned on the fly? How do we flexibly vary the speed, amplitude, and even the style of complex movements using a redundant arm and do it without relearning? How do we perform reaching behaviors correctly with novel tools? In particular, where did the competence to use tools come from? Clamp joints or visual prisms, again without relearning. And how do we learn complex sequential skills like handwriting, and what would be the underlying representations of such control? So why don't we just start with the simple idea, but a profound one in understanding how we move, the idea of movement synergies. It's well known that muscle groups work together in a common task, so I can move my entire hand and arm together. That greatly simplifies control and planning, and it lessens the number of degrees of freedom that require executive control. So we need to ask, how are synergies controlled? And at least in our hands, Dan Bullock and I in the 80s began an adventure in trying to understand this when we introduced the vector integration to endpoint model with the acronym BEAT for FAST. And this is a trajectory controller that clarifies what I like to call the 3 S's of movement control: synergy, synchrony, and speed. Well, by synergy, for example, I can reach with my entire hand-arm system in one movement, or I can reach with my hand-arm, reach with my arm, and then clasp my hand. So this would be like one big synergy. This would be like 2 synergies. And I can dynamically bind and twill. Secondly, whenever I bring together muscle groups in a synergy, they contract synchronously. Even though the muscles have to move by different degrees, they all do it at equal time. And finally, I can do it slowly, or I can do it quickly. So how do we control synergy, synchrony, and speed? And our thought was to factorize position and speed. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, when you think about movement control, there are planned and automatically controlled variables. So like when you and I try to plan to do something, we might consider where do we want to move. Let's say I want to move there. And we might consider how fast do we want to move there. But automatically we'll be computing where we are now. We'll be compensating for expected loads and inertias. We'll be automatically compensating for changes in the motor plan. And our thought was when these variables interact together in an appropriate way, our movement trajectory is a kind of emergent invariant of those factors. Well, the VEAT model itself is terribly simple, and therein lies its power. So here are a few of the main ideas. You load up a target position vector or where you want to move. You compare it with an outflow representation of where you are now, which we call the present position vector. So my hand is here, that's where I am, that's where the target is. The claim is that you load the target position vector in an excitatory way into a difference vector stage, and you load in the present position in an inhibitory way. So you subtract where you are from where you want to be, that gives you a difference vector that computes the direction and distance that you have to move to get from where you are to where you want to be. And then you take the difference vector and integrate it into the present position vector, moving your hand-arm system along the way until you integrate the PPV and it equals the TPV, the DV equals 0, and you stop. So it's called the vector integration to endpoint because you integrate this vector through the present position command till you get to the endpoint. So these DVs now, keep in mind, are very different from what we considered when we were looking at arc-like systems. In DVs, you're doing inhibitory matching. Remember I said the where stream does a lot of inhibitory matching and is computing mismatches. Well, we're now in that world. Well, you also have to bring volition into the act, and so the question is, how is speed controlled? And the claim is there's a non-specific multiplicative go signal, which is a kind of volitional will to act signal. Well, what do I mean by that? Let's say I am where I am, and I load in a new target, and I compute a difference vector. But the question is, when do I want to move? The claim is that the go signal multiplies each component of the DV, and then the product of DV times go is integrated into the present position. Well, first, why do you multiply? That's so you don't change the direction that's computed by the DV. Why do you multiply after the DV and before the present position? That's so that when you integrate this product, the present position can be compared with the target position, and when they're 0, you'll stop. Moreover, you want the go to come after the DV because you want to know what your desired distance and direction are before you volitionally convert them into action. And it turns out that these factors alone explain a huge amount of data. So it's a very simple kind of idea. One thing that's important to keep in mind is that when you take a DV and multiply it by a volitional go signal, because that's going to be integrated into the present position, it becomes a velocity vector. So you have an outflow velocity vector and an outflow position command that can both be used to control movement. Okay, well, why would we tend to believe this? Well, it helped us to understand a lot of data. So, for example, how do you digitally switch to a new target and then get a continuous synchronous trajectory out of it? Well, let's say I switch to a new target and I turn on my go signal. You can turn it on with a lot of different forms in time. But what happens is you start to integrate your present position command to the new target in time. This is what happens to the DV. First it goes up, and then as you get where you want to go, it goes down. And if you take the time derivative of the present position vector, you get a unimodal outflow velocity profile that's a little asymmetric. Well, you also automatically get the synchrony of synergist. Remember, so I said if I contract my hand-arm system, each muscle might have to contract by different degrees in equal time. And that's just an emerging property here. So let's say you use the same go signal, but for different synergists, one that starts out where its DV component is 20 and one that starts out where its DV component is 60, if you integrate that and look at their outflow velocity profiles and you rescale the ordinate, they're identical. So you get synchrony here. And how do you know that that's true apart from the simulation? Well, it's easy to prove, because if you look at the time rate of change of the difference vector and assume that it's just decaying when you're not exciting it, and what's exciting it is the difference of where you are from where you want to be, and then you take that difference vector and you multiply it by a go signal, so that's your velocity vector, here's your velocity, and you're going to integrate that to get your position, then you just prove that the position is going to depend on the difference between where you're stopping and where you want to go, times a function that's independent of where you start and where you want to go. And that's just what it means to say you get synchrony. So what kind of data does this explain? Well, there's really a ton of it. Let me just give you some illustrative examples. So first, it's just a fact that velocity profiles from movements of similar duration but unequal distance superimpose after velocity axis rescaling. So here you would have a family of such curves, and they have this kind of form that you just saw a moment ago. It's also a fact, and this has become theoretically important, that velocity profile asymmetry varies with duration, with slower movements having a longer tail than faster movements, and you saw a moment ago a little of that asymmetry. This is an emergent property, and it really isn't easy for certain other models to explain, but it just comes out of the wash here. There are other data that are relevant. For example, there was a popular spring-to-endpoint model that, the arm is just a spring, you set a new endpoint, and it bounces to its new equilibrium point. In Emilio Bizzi's lab, they deafferented monkeys, and then when the monkey, let's say, was going to be moving its arm to a certain target light, and you'd have a board over its arm, you would surreptitiously pull its arm to the target, and then turn on the light, and the task of the monkey is to move to that target. Well, if it were just the spring, it would have already have sprung. But when you let go of the arm, what happens is, so here you pull it over, when you let go of the arm, it goes back to a trajectory that's been integrating. So there is a spring-like property, but there's also an underlying integrated trajectory. And that's what we're talking about. Another property that comes out is a speed accuracy trade-off called Fitt's law, where, for example, the width of the target varies inversely with the movement time, but through a logarithmic function. So this is the trade-off. And I should emphasize that Fitt's law has a number of contributors, but this may be one of them right in the trajectory generator. There's an important stability property that comes out of the wash, and that we call equifinality, which is an automatic compensation for staggered onset time. So the issue is that when you're making sequential movements, what if some of your synergies fell behind because of noisy conditions or some kind of mechanical failure? Well, this shows that this kind of controller tries to compensate for it. So let's say if you had synergists that were delayed by 150 or 300 time units, and you let it go, well, they come out contracting to their final state almost synchronously. And this gets harder and harder to do as you get faster and faster, but you get a tremendous tendency to resynchronize your synergists. Another property due to Georgopoulos' lab is that, let's say, again, you have a monkey and it's trying to move to target lights, and let's say you turn on a target light and it gets ready to launch its arm there, and then as the arm is starting to launch, you put on another light, and the monkey is trained so that it should try to switch from here to here. And if you do that, then the maximum speed of the switch trajectory is much faster than any direct trajectory. And in fact, when Dan and I talked to the person, he said, we're the only people who are interested in this fact. Well, that's because we thought we could understand it. And what we claim is that part of it is just that when the second trajectory starts, it's riding on the go signal of the first trajectory, and so you get an anomalous amplification of its maximum speed. Well, are there neural markers for these proposed computations? Well, we suggest that the target position vector where you want to go is computed in the posterior parietal cortex. The difference vector is computed in the motor cortex, and the go signal is computed in the globus pallidus of the basic ganglia. Well, are there evidences for this? So first, let's look at the difference vector. There's a very famous population vector hypothesis which suggests that motor and parietal cortex compute a vectorial representation of movement direction. And let me just show you some recordings of a vector cell in the monkey motor cortex. Several labs have noticed this asymmetric profile of activation. Well, now if you look back at how the DV integrates just naturally, you can see there's a striking similarity. So it's this kind of marker that gives us confidence that there's something like the DV going on. But what about this volitional go signal? So keep in mind the whole point of the go signal, you can look at a target, you can load in DVs, you're primed to move, but then only when you turn on your volition, hey, it's time to move. So let me make it clearer. Here's my PPD. I load it in. Well, I could load it in my right eye, my left eye, my nose, they're all loaded. I turn on the go signal for my right arm, and I go. Okay. Well, what about evidence for go signal? Well, there's a lot of it. One study, an early study of Horak and Anderson, had 5 consistent properties. First, speed control. If you stimulate this region, it decreases response duration, so you speed it up. Non-specific, all synergists on one side of the body speed up, so this is the kind of non-specific activation of all the synergists. This property of factorization of the DV times go. Onset times and accuracy are unaffected. So you're just speeding up, but you're not changing the computation of the DV. Gating, stimulation without a response instruction causes no movement. So it's like a go with a 0 DV. Nothing happens. The idea is it's like multiplication. You multiply a positive number times 0 and you get 0. And then the other side of gating in fast freeze, if you stimulate the adjacent inhibitory zone, it's like a go and a stop. There's an opponent organization. That'll stop movement dead in mid-course. So there's these data suggestive of the existence of GOs and DVs in motor cortex and basal ganglia. Well, the Veek model explains a lot more data still, and so you might think it's a beginning, but it's certainly not sufficient. In particular, it cannot explain lots of data about how we deal with obstacles to movement, or how we deal with various variable forces that are placed on our arms. So let's just look at how you have to expand the model to get a deeper understanding. Well, first, there are at least 2 roles of the PPV, the present position vector itself. One is as a perceived position vector, which I'll continue to call the PPV. This is an estimate of the current limb position to give you an outflow movement signal to compute the DV. But the second is as an outflow position vector, okay, or an OPV, which is actually an outflow movement command to your muscles to move them. So one is you correlate discharge, and one is your signal to say move. And in the presence of obstacles, these two things aren't the same, because obstacles can prevent the outflow position vector realization. So let's say I'm commanding my arm to move there, but as I move, I hit an obstacle. So the PPV accurately represents the current limb position, even with obstacles, but the OPV, where I want to go, isn't realized. And so this suggests if you're going to be able to deal with this situation, to know where you really are, and contrast it with where you want to go to formulate a strategy for fixing things, you should code these 2 different kinds of information by different populations. And so through an analysis of this kind, Dan Bullock and I, with our student Paul Chisek, who has for some years now been in John Kalaska's lab in Montreal, where John is one of the top motor control physiologists, have started giving more precise markers to these computations. So like the difference vector, there are cells in the posterior parietal area 5 called the phasic cells that behave just like it. The perceived position vector, or PPV, there are cells that behave just like this anterior area 5 tonic cells. What about the target position vector? There are cells like this in area 5 and in area 7D. So we were starting to get really much finer in our analysis, And in fact, if you do a sustained analysis of obstacles and how the command, the trajectory controller, compensates for variable forces, you're led to an enhanced model which tries to simulate recorded data in multiple experiments, in multiple normal and abnormal conditions in cortical areas 4 and 5. And this is just comparisons of model simulations and data that's been recorded from a number of labs, notably from the classical lab. And I could spend an hour just on that, but I just want you to realize that this has become a very precise kind of analysis now. Okay, well, if you go further and don't just want to control how the trajectory knows how to compensate for forces, but how you actually move the arm in the presence of forces in a way that doesn't disturb your desired movement trajectory, then you need at least 3 movement modules. First, there's the cortical planning and control of variable speed trajectories of a multi-joint limb in the presence of obstacles. And that we need this deep-like vector integration endpoint controller. But then to actually turn these commands into movements, you really need to analyze spinal muscular force generation. There's a lot going on in the spinal cord. And you want this force generation to occur without disruption of planned limb position as limb stiffness changes. And here the key problem is to factorize length and tension. So by this we mean length is sort of like our positional commands. Tension is how you deal with the variable forces. So we wanted something that rhymed with fleet, with V, so we called it fleet. I guess we could have, instead of having fleet, we could have called this flasp, factorization of length and speed, but you know, what can you do? It's just an acronym. And so this gave us a lot of insight into very detailed properties of the spinal cord, but I can't talk about that at all today. And then there was a third part of cerebellar adaptive time gain control, which I will be talking about today. And we had a lot of different students working with us, in addition to Paul, Pepe Contreras Vidal, who is now at Maryland, and John Fiala, who is at BU, and I think there he is. He's here. Thank you for coming. So this is the kind of situation you get into from that simple beginning. You have your deep-like thing going on here. We're going to have to look at how the cerebellum does adaptively timed compensation of gain. And then we have a fleet-like thing going on, including the spinal cord. And the spinal circuit has gotten extremely detailed, and it includes things like, what are the mysterious Renshaw cells doing? What is the size principle all about? A number of really interesting topics that I can't talk about, unfortunately, but I hope you might be interested in following up. So in summary, a lot was known about hand and arm control before we began modeling sequential movements like handwriting. And it was important that we study reaching first, because it's known that handwriting exploits arm movement properties that evolved for other skills. So reaching is a much more primitive skill than handwriting, which, you know, depended on the development of civilization. And so it was known, for example, that, and I'll quote, the most effective models of handwriting include skew effects and velocity functions. Well, they fell out of the wash already. It was known that the isochrony principle was important, namely the tendency of strokes of widely different size to be completed with approximately equal duration. This is that synchrony property. And it was known that in two-part arm movements, which are sort of like a step in the direction of handwriting, the maximum curvature of the movement tended to co-vary with the minimum velocity. Well, let's look at an example of isochrony so that you see what I mean. This is work out of the toilet group. So let's say here you write this word, and now you look at the vertical velocity as you write it and the horizontal velocity, and you can see this sort of synchronous kind of lining up of velocity profiles. What about the inverse relationship between curvature and velocity? Here's some data from Edelman and Flash, and let's say you're making a U-shaped curve, and here, where you have maximal curvature, you have minimal tangential velocity, so they tend to covary inversely. Instead of talking about tangential velocity, you can equivalently talk about angular velocity, and this leads to the so-called two-thirds power law, where in a lot of cases, the angular velocity of the movement is approximately proportional to the two-thirds power of the curvature. There are also deviations of this law, but it's, a useful heuristic. And it then becomes a really interesting issue. How could a law like that relate or result from movement learning? Well, if we're going to go into handwriting or other complex sequential movements, how are you going to begin to represent curved movements? Well, one possible strategy is that you should think of curved movements as a superposition of straight strokes, but they're due to asynchronously triggered synergies. So in what we've been talking about up to now, let's say you look at the velocity profiles in the x and y direction, and if they're going to be superimposed, then you're going to get a synchronous movement. But if the y velocity profile precedes the x, you can get a curvilinear movement like this. And if the x precedes the y, you can get the opposite kind of curvature. So that suggests at least beginning to consider how is timing of these various strokes controlled, because by timing them asynchronously, you can get very different kind of shapes. So it turns out that there are several types of adaptive timing you can consider. You can consider the controlling the staggered onset times of different synergies, as I've just indicated. You can also control the rate with which a given synergy is read out. So this then led to the first effort for us to handle handwriting, and we called it the beat-write model. It's work Dan and I did with our student Christian Manus. And although beat-write certainly isn't the end of the story, it did try to give us a feeling for what is a motor program and how would it interact with a trajectory generator, and also an explicit hand model. So in particular about the motor program, what kind of motor program would we have? Well, that led us to bring in ideas about working memory that I talked about in my first two talks. And here the idea would be that somehow the item in order working memory, when it's reading out commands, would be reading out something like DVs. And then you'd have to ask, well, when do you want to read out these DVs? So you have a very compressed representation, DV, 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 these discrete symbolic DVs being read out. And with the hand, the problem with the hand is it has more degrees of freedom in the space in which it moves. You might think, oh my God, how do you deal with a redundant hand? And it turns out redundancy makes things so much easier. So let me show you what this first beat-write model looks like, and show you how a motor program can be an emergent property of interactions between a symbolic working memory plan and a continuous trajectory generator. So here we just have the target position, the difference vector, the outflow speed command, your outflow position command with your negative feedback. Sitting above it, we claim, is a working memory, an item in order working memory, and as a rehearsal wave, remember you have a rehearsal wave, comes in, it's going to read out the DV. Now that DV is also going to be multiplied by a volitional signal, we claim, and it's a non-specific volitional signal, But a non-specific signal here makes your handwriting grow, whereas a non-specific signal here makes you move faster. So, this is sort of like the cognitive impenetrability of volition. I want to make it bigger, I want to make it faster. But at the place, let's say, coming from the basal ganglia where the command comes, what happens is impenetrable to your volition because it depends on who it's talking to. It's into totally different things. So the question then is, well, how do you know if I want to write faster and I want to write bigger, how do I know, since I don't know anything here, that it's going to come out as handwriting? So the idea is that when your speed is either 0 or a local maximum, you create a rehearsal wave that creates a burst from this vector plan and the next dB comes out. And if you do that, I'm not saying this is the whole truth, but if you do that, as you'll see, you can get a lot of bang for your buck. What do I mean by a redundant hand? Well, for example, you might have a vertical wrist rotation, you might have a finger extension, you might have a horizontal wrist rotation. You're trying to make markings in 2D with, let's say, these 3 dimensions of movement. So it's redundant. You have more degrees of freedom than the space in which you move. And this slide just indicates that if all I had were 2 degrees of freedom, and I'm trying to make this movement, I won't have unimodal velocity profiles. But if I have more degrees of freedom, then I can control each of these degrees of freedom to make the movement with a unimodal velocity profile. And if you believe that one strategy of the system is it's sensitive to either when you're not moving at all or when you're at a local max, you can see that at least you have well-defined volitional command for when to unload your working memory. So let me just show you by simulation some of the nice properties of such a simple idea. The main thing is if you ask, where is the control of the trajectory? Do you have little curves in your brain? The answer is no. There is no explicit trajectory anywhere. It's an emergent invariant of these simple interactions. So for that alone, I think it's good to think about. Okay, so let's say you wanted to write the letter B. You can use a very stereotyped go signal, the same shape over and over, but probably time. And you read out appropriate difference vector commands, and you get your B shape. Moreover, just from those simple ideas, you get speed invariance. So if you double the go signal, you have form shape invariance, but twice as fast. Okay, so that's an emergent property. This is the point everyone scratches their head, because you have to go home and think about it. That's why it's hard to model. It's just an emergent property, these simple ideas. That's what I mean when I say that the math helps you. If you analyze it, a few simple ideas, and then wham, things that happen, and you say, oh my God, how did that happen? Well, that's the power of modeling. You also get size invariance. If you increase that non-specific row signal, these are rescaled images, but this is twice as big. Well, no, this is how much is big, 3 times as big, that's twice as big, the form is invariant. So you have form invariance on the speed and size. On the other hand, you can vary style because you can have a synergy-specific row signal. It doesn't have to have one scalar hit all the synergies. If you have slightly different scalars hitting different synergies, then you can write in very different ways without doing any learning. Is the 2/3 power law hidden in here? Well, the answer is yes, because if you now look at the tangential velocity, is it proportional to the 1/3 power of the radius of curvature, which is just rewriting what we just talked about there a little differently. And you can see here that you have quite a nice overlap of those 2 curves. So that fell out of the wash. Now the problem with the Beak-Wright model is that it didn't explain how children learn to write. And so we want to be able to also understand that. And so the question is, how do children learn curvilinear movements by imitating written letters? This is not the only way to learn, but it's one way that children do use. And here the problem is how do varying, error-prone movements during learning become correct, efficient movements after repeated trials. And in order to understand that, my student, Raina Payne, who's now working in motor control in Japan, and I developed what we call the adaptive beat-right movement model. And I'll be talking a little bit about that with you today. Not surprisingly, the adaptive beat-right model had a trajectory generator, it had speed and size control, it had a working memory. But in order to learn to imitate, we also needed attentional control, which we think of as going on, among other places, in the parietal cortex. And we needed adaptive timing, which we think of as being controlled, in this case, by the cerebellum. And so what I'm going to now do with you is to talk a little bit about how the cerebellum seems to carry out adaptive timing. So this is going to be a study in motor learning, but it's also a study in how we learn to time things. So it brings up the very large issue of adaptively timed behavior. So how do humans and animals learn adaptively timed behavior? And in particular, are there universal biochemical substrates of this kind of learning? And here in this work, which was done with Van Villard and Jean Fiala, we have a model that goes from behavior through physiology and anatomy down to biochemistry. We don't always or even often have the link to biochemistry, but in this case, it seemed to make quite a bit of sense. So I'll at least sketch for you what we think the biochemical substrate is. Now, I want to emphasize that there seem to be multiple sites of adaptive timing in the brain. There seems to be a hippocampal dentate CA3 circuit, which I was hoping to tell you about on the second day, but I was just too ambitious with my plan. Today I'll tell you a little about the cerebella and the basal ganglia circuits. And one reason I list them all together, even though they do functionally different things, is that our belief at the moment is that they all share a similar biochemical substrate and also homologous circuits. In particular, we think that a key role here is played by the metabotropic glutamate receptor system, and that in all of these cases there's some kind of a time inhibitory gate that opens and lets something happen. So sensory motor timing involves things like reaching and handwriting and piano playing and dancing, even delayed non-matching for sample. But to get started, I want to consider a very simple example which goes back to cognitive emotional interactions, which is the rabbit nictitating membrane. And that's because this system has really been worked out in enormous detail, and so we really have a challenge in trying to understand all of the aspects of it. This has to do with classical conditioning of eye blinks to a tone in the rabbit. Okay, so let me just give you a little bigger picture of that so you can see what's going on. Richard Thompson and his colleagues, notably Ted Berger, have done a wonderful job working out the anatomy and physiology of the system. So the idea is a conditioned stimulus comes in, it's a tone, it goes up this pathway here into Morse fibers, then granule cells, then parallel fibers in the cerebellum, and these parallel fibers went through one of the most remarkable cells in the brain, the Purkinje cells, described by Ramon y Cajal, that have these huge dendritic trees. So the CS is coming in through the parallel fibers and intersecting the Purkinje cells. The US, in this case, is either a puff of air or a little shock to the eyelid. And that's coming up through the dorsal accessory olive into climbing fibers that are going to be wrapping themselves around Purkinje cell dendrites and also going to the interpositus nucleus. I should remark that the Morse fibers also branch into the interpositus nucleus. So the idea is you pair bell, air puff, and you get a timed response of eye blink in the rabbit. Okay, so what is the evidence that the cerebellum is involved in this timing? Well, first, if you have lesions of the cerebellar cortex, that's going to lead to maladaptively timed condition responses. Moreover, activity in the interpositus nucleus, that's that subcerebellar nucleus that I just described, those cells, their activity precedes and models the behavioral response. So if they get timed in a certain way, the response is timed in the same way. Moreover, you can directly stimulate the Morse fibers that go into the parallel fibers, and you can directly stimulate the climbing fibers, so you can have electrical CS-US correlation, and that can train the animal to give you an adaptively timed condition response. And direct stimulation of the CS and the US of the interpositus does it, and the Purkinje cells display a decrease in simple spike firing during the CS-US interval. The main idea here is that, I'll show you this in a moment again, the Purkinje cells are inhibiting the interpositus, and you have a kind of timed depression here which makes them fire less, and that disinhibits the interpositus to read out the learned gain. So I'll say that to you a few times so you get the main idea. Another important fact is if you ablate the cerebellar cortex, that eliminates adaptive timing of conditioned idling. So here is your adaptively timed response before ablation, and then after ablation you get this very quick response with no adaptive timing, as Peridot has shown. I should, of course, remark, if there are people in the audience who don't have a clue where the cerebellum is, here it is, this big lobe in the left back of the brain. Well, what about these learned delays? What are some of their properties? Well, one of the big mysteries is the delays can be so long. So these curves are, again, these are old curves due to Smith. And here you have time running along, and where these curves peak is at the ISI. And you can see you're going out to 2,000 milliseconds here. So notice that as you move further and further out, as the ISI gets bigger and bigger, these curves get wider and wider. So narrow, a little wider, wider, wider. That's called the Weber law, okay? That the width of the curve co-varies with the position of the peak of the mean. And secondly, there's an inverted U here. Remember I talked about inverted U in classical conditioning. There's an inverted U in adaptive timing too, okay? And this shows that if you increase the intensity of shock, the timing stays the same, but you get bigger and bigger responses, which we can also simulate. But the main mystery is, how do you bridge such a long time interval? We're not talking about milliseconds, we're talking about seconds, so 100 to 1,000 times slower. So this is another kind of medium-term memory. Remember, we were talking about medium-term memory. And so here our claim is that the metabotropic glutamate receptor, second messenger system, is very enriched in cerebellar Purkinje cell dendrites, and that's doing the job for us. And this paper with John Fiala and Dan and I appeared in Journal of Neuroscience to describe this work in much greater detail than I can today. But the neurophysiological hypotheses that we made are the following: that CS-US pairing leads to it, and also they are consistent with the data. CS-US pairing leads to a timed long-term depression of Purkinje cell firing. So this is a case where when you pair things, it doesn't go up, it goes down. The Purkinje cell has been tonically firing. Now it slows its firing. By firing less, you disinhibit activation in the interpositus, and you free the interpositus to fire. So again, another violation of Hebb. Also, I didn't have a chance to observe, one reason I keep hacking on this is Hebb wasn't the first person to make these hypotheses. At least please go back to Pavlov, who also made them in great detail in the nerve context. Okay, so reducing the Purkinje cell inhibition at the cerebellar interpositus opens a time gate, that's what I just said. And then the interpositus cells can then read out, so here's the CS pathway, they can read out learned gains that control the correct response amplitude, and they do it at the right time because the gate opens in an adaptively timed way. So let me just show this to you a little more schematically. So the claim is that the CS is activating more C5s that are going to go to Purkinje cell dendrites and interpositus cells. The claim is that the US activates these remarkable climbing fibers, and that the learning here is going to cause long-term depression in a timed way. By slowing down the firing of these guys, you open the gate and express the learned gain down there. Now, biochemically, our claim is that it proceeds as follows. That the CS input uses the MORC fiber pathways to activate what we like to call a spectrum of metabotropic glutamate receptor sites at the Purkinje cell dendrites. By spectrum, I mean that you have sites that are reacting at different rates. So some are going to react soon, some are going to react a little later, some a little later, some a little later. It's like sampling the time window with these little windows of activation. And these sites react at different rates to produce diacylglycerol, DAG, and to release intracellular calcium, which together activate a protein kinase C, a PKC. So that's what happens to the CS. Then the US uses the climbing fiber pathways to activate a cyclic GMP-dependent protein kinase, PKG. And then the idea is you do classical conditioning with PKC and PKG. And that activation phosphorylates target proteins in calcium-dependent potassium channels. So the intuitive idea, and I'll show you a picture of what I mean, learning selects and amplifies those spectral components when you have this convergence of these two signals. And if you just put in the CS, you get LTP due to dephosphorylation. Okay. So what does such a spectrum look like? The idea is that you have these little windows of activation which are sampling an interval that can go out up to 2 to 4 seconds, and that learning, like if I have pairing with a US occurring here at this ISI, it's going to amplify the effect of these components, and these other components out here are going to go down, and that's going to cause a peak of activation at the ISI. And if you do this right, it obeys the Weber law, as we'll see in a moment. So the claim is that a calcium transient is produced subsequent to synaptic activation, and the response latency of that calcium transient is determined by the number of these metabotropic receptors at a synapse. And so you have a kind of gradient of receptors, and that gradient of receptors in space translates into a gradient of sampling intervals in time. And that the range of latencies can span, hundreds of milliseconds to a few seconds. Now we want to emphasize that a similar thing seems to happen in many types of cells. And here is data on histamine-stimulated calcium pulses in a single HeLa cell. That's a kind of cultured cancer cell which has nothing to do with classical conditioning. And here, individual cells have transient responses with different latencies, so you can get a spectrum coming out of here because different parts of the cell have receptors with different latencies, And if you take the population response, you can get something like that, which is sort of what you find if you look at the population response in the cerebellar Purkinje cells. So the question is, if you do this spectral timing where conditioning is going to amplify some of these components, the ones that are properly timed while the others get downregulated, can you learn adaptive timing? And the answer is yes, and this gives an example of a population response of long-term depression. Now, John Fiala worked hard to simulate a lot of other biochemical data in order to be able to fit this with some confidence. I'll just skip over that today. But when our biochemical fits were made, we were then able to make fits to this kind of inverted U data. This is a fit to data of Steinman, etc. And moreover, if you cut out the model cerebellar cortex, then you do get an early response that's no longer adaptively timed. Finally, because you have a spectrum there, if you have CSs at more than one interval, you can have adaptively timed LTD at the respective intervals, and moreover, each of these adaptively timed things obeys a Weber law. Now that's going to be important to handwriting too, because for handwriting, we're going to have this situation where we might be more continuously sampling these spectra through time as you're making mistakes at variable times. Now, I want to just comment, why is spectral timing so widespread? And I believe that this metabotropic system seems to occur in several brain systems where a sensitive response is needed to signals that vary greatly in amplitude and duration, including in photoreceptors. And in fact, when John and I were talking about that first, when we were looking for a biochemical substrate, we looked at photoreceptor data to see if there was some background there. And metabotropic stuff was all over the place, and then we looked back at cerebellar data and found it there too. One way to think about this is, suppose you have a very weak signal to a photoreceptor. Well, if you want to get a reliable response, since you don't have much in amplitude, you may have very slow integration over time. So you try to get in time the reliability that you don't have in amplitude. On the other hand, what if you have an intense, important signal, like a lion is leaping at you? Well, you don't want to wait this long because you lunch them. You want to have an intense, very fast activity. Well, let's just interpolate now. So we have all these possibilities, we have a spectrum, and now let's tune the spectrum so that if we do know what the expected durations are, then we'll be able to adaptively time our behavior. And I think that's what's going on. So I think the metabotropic system is doing that all over the place. And I'll show you one more example of it before the end of the day.